According to spiritual revelations attributed to Padre Pio, there are signs, marks that distinguish those who have been touched by God in a special way. Marks that more often than not go unnoticed, even by the very people who carry them. Today, I need to tell you something that most people never stop to consider. 3 secret marks that, according to spiritual tradition and the teachings lived by Padre Pio, only the chosen ones possess. But here's what I need you to understand. These marks are not titles of honor. They are not privileges. They are responsibilities and many times silent crosses. And the third mark is the one that trips people up the most because it looks nothing like what you'd expect from God. In fact, most people spend years running from it without realizing it's the very sign they've been waiting for. Before we go any further, write in the comments right now, Lord, if I am chosen, guide my path. Because this video may not have reached you by accident, and perhaps God is trying to show you something today. Padre Pio, known for his deep union with Christ, carried the wounds of Jesus on his own body. But he always taught that there are marks even deeper than those, marks you cannot see with your eyes, but that reveal themselves in the soul. He used to say that God does not choose perfect people, but available souls. Souls that even when wounded, keep seeking. Souls that even when they fall, rise again. And that is where the first mark begins. There is something you need to know about Padre Pio before we go any further. Not the version that exists only in paintings and prayer cards, the real man, the one who woke before dawn every single day, knelt on cold stone floors, and spent hours in prayer before most people had even opened their eyes. The one who sat in a wooden confessional for up to 18 hours at a time, listening to the weight of human suffering, absorbing the pain of others as if it were his own. He was not a distant figure wrapped in holiness. He was someone who knew what it felt like to be tired, to doubt, to suffer without explanation. He bled from wounds he did not ask for and endured spiritual attacks that would have broken most people beyond repair. And yet, through all of it, he developed an understanding of the soul that was unlike anything his contemporaries had seen. He spent decades observing people, listening to them, praying over them. And what he came to understand was this, that God leaves fingerprints on certain souls, not visible ones, not the kind that show up in photographs or earn applause in a room, but deep interior marks, patterns that repeat themselves across different lives, different backgrounds, different levels of faith, patterns that once you know how to recognize them, become unmistakable. That is what we are talking about today. Not a checklist, not a spiritual personality quiz, but a genuine reflection on 3 marks that Padre Pio identified in souls that God was working with deeply, souls that were being shaped for something, souls that were being prepared. And the reason this matters is simple. Many people who carry these marks spend years believing something is wrong with them. They feel different, displaced, like they are standing slightly outside of life, watching it happen around them rather than fully participating in it. They wonder why faith feels harder for them than it seems to for others. Why peace is so difficult to hold on to. Why no matter how much they try to settle, something keeps pulling them forward. If that resonates with you, stay close. Because what Padre Pio taught about these marks changes everything. The first mark is a restlessness that never fully goes away. And before you dismiss that as anxiety or dissatisfaction or some kind of personality flaw, stay with it for a moment, because there is a specific kind of restlessness that has nothing to do with being unhappy or ungrateful. It is something deeper, something that persists even when life is objectively going well. Even when there is nothing obviously wrong, you know the feeling. You are sitting in a room full of people you care about, and something in you is quietly, almost imperceptibly, reaching for something else. You cannot name it. You cannot point to it, but it is there, like a conversation happening just below the surface of everything you do. like a frequency your soul keeps tuning into even when the rest of you is trying to focus somewhere else. St. Augustine described it in a line that has outlasted centuries. Our heart is restless until it rests in thee. He wrote those words not as a theological observation, but as a confession, a description of his own interior experience before he surrendered fully to God. And Padre Pio, who knew Augustine's writings deeply, used to say that this restlessness was not a sign of weakness in a soul. It was a sign of origin, a reminder that the soul came from somewhere beyond this world and that it knows on some level it cannot articulate that it has not yet arrived home. Think about what that means for a moment. The very thing that makes you feel out of place, the thing that keeps you from being completely satisfied with the surface of life, the thing that makes you reach for more even when you have enough. That thing might not be a problem to solve. It might be a compass. Padre Pio used to say that God does not leave souls he has marked alone. He disturbs them, not cruelly, not arbitrarily, but with purpose. He keeps them slightly off balance in the world because he does not want them to mistake the world for their destination. He keeps the hunger alive because the hunger is what keeps them moving toward him. A woman once came to Padre Pio deeply troubled. She told him she had tried everything. She had a good life, a loving family. Her faith was sincere, and yet she could not find peace. She felt guilty for the restlessness, as if her inability to simply be content was an act of ingratitude toward God. Padre Pio listened carefully, and then he said something she never forgot. He told her that her restlessness was not ingratitude, it was longing. And longing, he said, is one of the most honest prayers a soul can offer. That reframe is everything, because so many people who carry this first mark spend enormous energy trying to fix it, quiet it, medicate it, outrun it. They fill the space with noise and movement and distraction, and it works for a while, but it always comes back. It always returns because it was never a malfunction, it was a message. If you recognize this in yourself, the invitation is not to finally find a way to silence it. The invitation is to follow where it leads, to let it be what it actually is, the beginning of a deeper interior life, the first thread of a conversation with God that has been waiting for you to stop running long enough to listen. Now, hold that thought, because what comes next will either confirm something you already suspected or completely rewrite the way you have been reading your own life. The second mark is harder to accept, and when you hear it, your instinct might be to push back because it challenges one of the most common assumptions people carry about what it means to walk closely with God. The second mark is this: the chosen ones do not have easier lives. They have harder ones, not harder in every way, not harder without purpose, but harder in the sense that they are given more to carry, more to face, more to endure. And this is not an accident. According to Padre Pio, it is a direct consequence of how deeply God is invested in a particular soul. He used an image that is worth sitting with. He said that the soul being shaped by God is like gold inside a furnace. The heat is not punishment. The heat is the process. The fire does not destroy the gold. It purifies it. It removes everything that was never truly part of it in the first place. And when it comes out the other side, it is more itself than it ever was before going in. That image is striking because it reframes suffering entirely, not as abandonment, not as evidence that God has turned away, but as evidence that God is present and actively working, that the fire you are standing in right now is not the result of being forgotten. It may be the result of being chosen. Padre Pio himself lived this with extraordinary intensity. He endured physical suffering that lasted for decades. He faced accusations from within the church he loved. He was forbidden at various points from saying Mass publicly, from answering letters, from exercising his ministry. He was investigated, doubted, and misunderstood by people who should have been his allies. And through all of it, he did not interpret those trials as signs that God had stepped back. He interpreted them as signs that God was very close. Look at the pattern in Scripture, and you will see it it everywhere. Joseph was thrown into a pit by his own brothers before he was elevated to save a nation. Job lost everything, absolutely everything, before he was restored. The apostles were scattered, imprisoned, and martyred. And Jesus himself, the one whose life is the ultimate template for every chosen soul, went to the cross before the resurrection. The pattern is consistent. The depth of the trial is proportional to the depth of what God is preparing. That does not make the pain easier to bear, but it does make it possible to bear it with a different posture, not collapsed under it, not shaking your fist at heaven, but standing inside it with a kind of hard-won trust that says, I do not understand this, but I know who is with me. Here is where Padre Pio issued his most urgent warning. He said the greatest danger for a soul in the midst of trials is not the trial itself. It is the interpretation. Because when the suffering is intense enough, when the darkness lasts long enough, the temptation to believe you have been abandoned becomes almost overwhelming. And that is precisely when many souls turn back. They have carried the weight faithfully for years. And then one morning they wake up and the weight feels like too much. And the silence from heaven feels like indifference. And they quietly close the door. They do not make a dramatic exit. They just stop. They settle for a version of life that asks less of them. And in doing so, they walk away from the very threshold they were about to cross. Padre Pio grieved this. He used to say that some of the souls closest to a breakthrough were the ones who gave up just before it arrived. Not because they were weak, but because no one had told them that the intensity of the trial could itself be a sign of how close they were to something significant. If you are in that place right now, if the weight feels disproportionate to what you think you deserve, if you have been faithful and the road still feels relentless, listen carefully. What you are carrying may not be evidence that you are losing. It may be evidence of where you are being taken, but here is what almost no one talks about. What happens to the soul that does not just endure the trials, but falls in the middle of them? Wanders, walks away entirely. What does Padre Pio say about that soul? That is the third mark, and it may be the most quietly devastating thing he ever taught, because it is the mark that belongs not to the strong ones, it belongs to the ones who failed, who left, who by every visible measure seem to have lost the thread completely. The third mark is the inability to stay away. This is not about people who never struggled. This is about people who struggled deeply, who walked away, who at some point decided that faith was too demanding or too confusing or simply too painful to maintain, who lived for a period outside of it, genuinely, not just going through motions, but actually setting it down and walking in a different direction. And who came back anyway, not because someone pressured them, not because circumstances forced them, but because something inside them refused to let the door close all the way. Because even in the middle of the distance, in the middle of the noise and the distraction and the deliberate looking away, there was something that kept pulling, quietly, persistently, without drama, just a steady, patient insistence that would not leave them alone. Padre Pio called this the mercy of the mark. He said that when God places his hand on a soul, he does not remove it because that soul wanders. He holds on, and the tension the soul feels when it moves away from God is not punishment, it is the resistance of that grip. God pulling back gently, continuously toward himself. There is a man whose story gets passed quietly through communities of faith in Italy. He had grown up with deep devotion, but had walked away from the church entirely in his 30s, convinced that his struggles were proof that God had never truly been present. He lived nearly 15 years outside of faith, built a life that had no room for it, and then in his late 40s, without any single dramatic event to explain it, he began to feel the pull again. He described it as a sound you cannot quite hear, but cannot stop listening for, something at the edge of everything. He eventually returned to confession, his first in nearly 2 decades. The priest who heard him, without knowing the details of his story, told him something that stopped him cold. He said, The fact that you came back is itself an act of grace. God has been holding your hand the whole time you thought you had let go. That is the third mark. Not the falling, not the wandering, but the returning. The fact that you cannot fully close the door no matter how hard you try. The fact that even in the middle of your most deliberate distance, something in you keeps one hand on the wall feeling for the way back. Padre Pio used to say that this capacity for return was not a human virtue, it was a gift. It was evidence that God had invested something in that soul that could not simply be discarded, that the soul, no matter where it went, carried within it something that belonged to God, and that belonging does not expire. If you have lived through seasons of distance, if you have wondered whether your wandering disqualified you from something, if you have felt that others who never strayed are somehow more deserving, hear this clearly. The prodigal son did not earn his return. He simply turned toward home. And the father who had been watching the road ran to meet him before he even finished the walk. The return itself was the sign, not its perfection, not its speed, just its direction. Now, if these three marks feel familiar, the question that follows naturally is, what do you do with this? How do you respond to what God seems to be doing in you? Padre Pio was not a mystic who kept his teachings locked in the abstract. He was intensely practical, and his answer was never complicated. It was consistent. He began with confession. He did not treat it as an obligation to be discharged once a year. He treated it the way a person who has been walking through mud treats a basin of clean water, with relief, with gratitude, with urgency. He believed that the soul accumulates weight it cannot always see, and that the confessional was a place where that weight was not just acknowledged, but actually lifted. He spent more hours in that small wooden box than almost anywhere else, because he had watched again and again what happened to a person on the other side of genuine confession. They walked in bent, they walked out straight, not because they suddenly had easier lives, but because they could breathe again. He returned constantly to the rosary, not as a devotional performance, but as a lifeline. He held those beads so often that they wore smooth in his hands. The decades rubbed down to near silence. He prayed it the way you would return to a conversation with someone you trust completely, without needing to impress, without needing to feel anything in particular, just showing up word by word, decade by decade, because the act of returning was itself the prayer. He told people who struggled with distraction not to be discouraged. He said that even a scattered rosary offered honestly was worth more than polished silence offered out of obligation. He spoke about the Eucharist in terms that were almost physical. He said that something real happened when a soul came to the table, something that operated below the level of feeling and did not require emotional confirmation to be true. He had watched people receive the Eucharist through tears, through numbness, through profound doubt, and he had seen in each of them in the days that followed a quality of endurance that could not be explained by willpower alone. He said once, "Stay close to the Eucharist and you will find that God does not need you to feel his presence in order for his presence to be real." And he spoke about the home, not as a superstition, but as a theology of space. He believed that the places where we actually live, where we argue and rest and raise children and face our worst moments, those spaces were not neutral. They could be given to God or they could be left to drift. A crucifix on the wall was not decoration, it was a declaration. Holy water at the door was not ritual, it was a daily physical act of saying, "This house belongs to someone." These small gestures of consecration, practiced faithfully, changed something in the atmosphere of a home, not always dramatically, but consistently, quietly over time. None of this is extraordinary. None of it requires a particular level of spiritual achievement or an unusual gift. It is available to everyone. And that, Padre Pio would say, is the entire point. The path for the chosen soul is not an elevated path. It is a faithful one. So, let's bring this home. Three marks: a restlessness that points beyond this world, trials that refine rather than destroy, and a capacity for return that no distance can permanently extinguish. None of these marks feel like gifts from the inside. They feel like burden, like confusion, like failure. And that perhaps is the most important thing Padre Pio wanted people to understand. The marks of the chosen often look from the inside exactly like the marks of the lost. The difference is not in how they feel. The difference is in what they produce over time. Because a soul that follows the restlessness finds eventually that it leads somewhere real. A soul that endures the trials without abandoning the journey finds on the other side a quality of faith that could not have been built any other way. And a soul that keeps returning, no matter how many times it has walked away, discovers that the distance was never as absolute as it felt, that the hand was always there, that it never let go. Padre Pio said this, and it is worth carrying with you. Pray, hope, and don't worry. Worry is useless. God is merciful and will hear your prayer. Not a promise of comfort without struggle, not a guarantee of a smooth path, but an assurance that the one holding the path is trustworthy, that the suffering has a shape, that the silence has a purpose, that the return is always possible. If something in this video reached you today, write in the comments, "I accept God's call." Not as a declaration of arrival, but as a direction, a turning toward, a first step or a thousandth step in the right direction. And if you know someone who is quietly questioning whether they have wandered too far, whether God is still present, whether any of this still applies to them, please share this video with them, not with a long explanation. Just send it. Sometimes the most important thing a person needs is to know that what they are living has a name, that it has been lived before, that it is not the end of the story. The channel exists because people like you believe these conversations matter. If this video meant something to you, leave a like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you are here for what comes next. Every person you reach with this message is someone who may have been sitting alone with questions they have never heard answered out loud. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying until the end. And remember what Padre Pio never stopped believing through everything he carried, that God does not begin a work in a soul and walk away from it halfway through. He finishes what he starts.